Thank you for inviting me to be here. The questions we're discussing today are critical, as we've been hearing all day. How do we find sustainable, resilient, environment-friendly, safe, nutritious, and productive solutions to feeding our growing global population? And despite the impressive advances in productivity we've had over the last 60 years, as we've heard, FAO actually reports we have 885 million people who are still food insecure. And as the previous speaker just said, for a long time, our approach to feeding people was based on arithmetic. As if we increase productivity, if we increase production, we will reduce hunger. And I think now what we need to think about is calculus. We need to think about how we can feed people, but at the same time, help manage risks, improve resilience, enhance nutrition, and livelihoods. So agricultural biodiversity, which is the universe that my organization works on, has to be the basis for food and agricultural production. The mission of my organization is to ensure that we conserve and sustainably use this agricultural biodiversity to solve these problems that we've been discussing today. So nearly 40% of the world's arable land is dedicated to the cultivation of three crops, wheat, rice, and maize, which also account for about 60% of the world's global intake from plants. As you can see from this graph, we have about 7,000 crops that have been used for food that we know of by humans and throughout history. Of those three crops I mentioned account for 60% of our daily calories. And if you add another 12 crops that include animal species, we get to about 75% of our production. So we have highly concentrated consumption patterns and highly concentrated production patterns. In addition, these three crops account for about half of the entire research budget of the International Agricultural Research Centers, of which we are a part. The funding that comes directly on the issues of biodiversity is about 4%. Now, the issues we've been talking about today indicate that might be somewhat unbalanced. So today for lunch, we had quinoa salad, which unfortunately I didn't see until after I had eaten. And we know there's been a huge quinoa boom as a result of this year of quinoa and work that my organization and others have been doing for the last decade in the Andes. However, there are 3,000 varieties of quinoas in existence, but we are eating only 2 that have been commercialized and are in the export market. So one single variety makes up about 40% of global production. Virtually all of banana exports rely on a few varieties known as the Cavendish or dessert banana, whereas there are about 500 different varieties that are known to be cultivated and consumed in more than 120 countries throughout the tropics. And we think there may be as many as 1,000 varieties of bananas, yet we focus on the one that is the most traded. In Asia, where 90% of the world's rice is produced and consumed, the number of rice varieties being grown has dropped from thousands to just a few dozen. In Thailand, for example, half of the cultivated area for rice uses only 2 varieties. And I was just in Washington earlier this week and heard that Burma is considering planting hybrid rice, which, great, no problems with hybrid rice, but the worry is that it could crowd out the thousands of varieties of native rice species that Burma has. If I could have the next, I only have two slides, okay. So this is a map of where we know we have high regions of biodiversity and biodiversity hotspots. And as was said by our keynote speaker, there's no escaping the fact that where we have those regions of high biodiversity happen to be the same regions where we have high incidences of poverty. And I guess one interpretation could be we should plant the world with corn and then we wouldn't have any more poverty. But I like to think the other interpretation is that we need to work with these poor farmers to make sure that we are using and conserving the agricultural biodiversity that we have left. So this is the group of farmers that we are working with are those who are in these areas who are the custodians of this agricultural biodiversity. But I think what's an important understanding that is coming out of my organization is that farmers will not conserve these varieties unless they find uses for them, unless there is some utility to those varieties, and that's what we're helping to discover and uncover. So let me give you a few examples of the work we're doing to make this a little more real. We talked about needing more stories, and I'm all in favor of good stories. So last year, Biodiversity worked with Save the Children UK and the National Museums of Kenya with support from the Gates Foundation to look at the cost and quality of diets. We studied how 5 wild and neglected species, neglected from the perspective of research, can reduce the cost and improve the nutrient content of modeled diets using something called the linear programming model. What we found was by adding these seasonably available foods, which happened to be free because they were wild foods, the diets were significantly less expensive, reducing the daily cost of feeding a 1 to 2-year-old child by 64% during the dry season. Now, we've heard from Tim and others saying, you know, sometimes the message comes across that we want more expensive food. And I think it's true in many cases that a good diet can be a more expensive diet, but what we're trying to show is that actually a good diet can be a cheaper diet. And I think we need to get those messages across. This diet that we found with the supplements of these five underutilized foods also happen to meet the daily nutrient requirement for women and children in this area of Kenya. In addition to looking at nutrition, we look at livelihoods and how biodiversity can help improve livelihoods of rural communities by identifying crops that can be brought to market and helping to build the linkages to get those crops to market. And marketing these crops is not the same as developing a maize value chain. It's very, very specific, and you need very specific understanding of those markets and specific partnerships with, sometimes with restaurants, sometimes with retail outlets, sometimes with wet markets. So it's a very, very difficult activity. But in Bolivia and Peru and India, we've been working with the support of the International Fund for Agricultural Development to enhance the conservation of traditional grains that happen to be high in proteins and micronutrients. In Bolivia, we worked with farmers to increase the production of Andean grains by 80% and the marketing opportunities by 80% and production by 40%. And these grains are much higher in vitamin C, iron, and they are drought tolerant to boot. And this is much higher in nutrition than the crops that are traditionally being grown in this area. In India, we've been working with with millet growers, where we've helped to increase their yield by 70% and their income by 30%. And small millets are much higher vitamin B, calcium, iron, magnesium, potassium, etc. We've also been working to show farmers that biodiversity can help in their agronomic practices. In Costa Rica, we found that complex landscapes, which utilize agroforestry, can save more than half of coffee harvest that is lost to pests. We also see benefits to soil regeneration and fertility over time. We've already talked about pollination, but I'll just say that the pollination services to coffee production in Costa Rica has been valued at about $60,000 per farm per year, whereas the very lauded Costa Rican Environmental Services Program pays farmers only 10% of that amount to maintain the biodiversity. So it's important that we realize that sometimes maintaining biodiversity actually provides a market benefit. I just want to briefly, I see my warning light over here. So because we've just seen what's happened with the recent typhoon in Philippines, some of the research that we have done in the past looked at what happened in Central America after the Hurricane Mitch, where we found that farms that had diversified with cover crops, intercropping, and agroforestry suffered less damage from hurricanes than the neighboring crops. And with Hurricane Ike, we found that those farms exhibited only a 50% loss instead of a near 100% loss of neighboring farms. And more importantly, those diversified farms bounced back more quickly. I want to conclude with talking about an initiative that we have launched with support of the Christensen Fund called the Bridging Agriculture and Conservation Initiative, where we're trying to bring these two communities together who often, as we've heard, don't talk to each other because one's focusing totally on production and the other's focusing on conservation. And we have a group of scientists who are working to pull together a meta-analysis of where we can see that these ecological intensification methods can also improve yield, can also address climate change and other efforts. So it's not trying to highlight where there are synergies in these agronomic practices and trying to see where we can minimize the trade-offs. So thank you very much.